Admiral Rogers retired from the Navy in 2018 after rising to the rank of 4-star admiral. He spent 4 years leading simultaneously as the commander of the U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency, creating the U.S. Department of Defense's largest war-fighting organization and leading the U.S. government's largest intelligence organization. He's a graduate of Auburn University and a fellow at MIT and Harvard. Everyone, we are in for a huge treat today. Admiral Rogers.
Thanks very much. So as an SEC graduate, it's great to be back in the South. I'm from Chicago originally, and now I live outside Philadelphia. But thanks very much for your time today. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to try to talk about 20 minutes, try to give you a broad overview about what I think is going on in the world today, what is impacting it and driving it. We'll do a little fireside chat, and then we'd like to make sure there's an opportunity for you to answer any questions you want. Now, let me start by saying we live in a time of hyper-political tension. I don't do politics. I didn't do it when I was in uniform, and I refuse to get sucked to it now in this stage of my life. So what I tell people is, I have worked with President Obama, President Biden, and President Trump personally. I've worked directly for all three of them. I'll walk you through, hey, here's the way they tended to think. This is what shapes their policy. This generally is what they're trying to achieve. I will leave it up to you to decide good or bad. I just find at the moment we are so divided. It is difficult just to have a conversation these days, and that really frustrates me. Because my attitude is if we can't talk to each other, we can't solve problems. And if we can't solve problems, we're not going to create a better lives for ourselves, our families, those who come behind us, and the broader set of nations that we interact with. So first, there is no doubt that we are now in the midst of a period of high churn, high change, high uncertainty, and for many people, a lot of angst about what's going on. It sure seems to be different. I'm very unsettled about where it's going and what's going to happen. So first thing I always try to say is, folks, if you study history, uncertainty is not a unique characteristics of the time we live in right now. If you study our nation's history, look, the greatest loss rate we experienced as a nation was not in a conflict with a foreign entity. It was a fight between ourselves. It's the most people we have ever lost in a fight between ourselves 150 plus years ago. So as a nation, we've gone through a lot. And my reminder to everybody is, look, I believe strongly in the future of the nation. I believe strongly in America and what it represents. And I believe that as a nation, we can get through any challenge. We just got to remember, in the end, it's about all of us and our ability to work together. It's about how we're going to create a better, stronger America for ourselves and our fellow citizens. So let me tell you a little bit of what I think is shaping the world around us. Number one, look, there is no doubt America is the strongest, most powerful, number one economy in the world. GDP, depending on the last number, is about $30 trillion. The second largest economy in the world, China. Anybody ever know what China's GDP is, gross domestic product? $19 trillion. It's almost half the size of the U.S. If you go beyond China and you go to economies number 3, 4, and 5, Germany, India, Japan, the three of them all around $4 trillion, or 7 times smaller than the U.S. economy individually. So number one, America's economic impact is massive on the entire rest of the world. Secondly, no other nation has the same historic political heft that we do. I'm not going to argue if it's good, bad, is it perfect? It is just reality. There's no other nation in the world right now that has the history of strong involvement in the broader world around it, and nobody else does at the scale that we traditionally have done. Now, we're glad to have a question if you want about, is that good, is that bad, how is that changing? Because President Trump definitely has a different, having worked directly with him and spent time with him in the Oval and the White House sit room, been up to Trump Tower and his office up there with him. He definitely has a different vision of what America's role in the broader world around us should be. But every time something significant happens in America, it broadly has impact around the world. Now, the second point I try to make is, because we tend to be very, obsessed is the wrong word, but because we see the impact of America, we tend to think, well, much of what's going on in the world, we're causing this. And while it's true, what I try to tell people is, look, what's going on in the world right now, the current administration is an accelerant. It is accelerating trends that were already there. It's not necessarily creating all this. My attitude is, guys, it's reflective of an undercurrent that's been going on for some time now, not just in America, but in the broader world around us. So, let's just talk about trade for a moment. Protectionism has been growing in US policy as well as in Europe and elsewhere for a decade. This is not something that, as much as we're focused on trade and tariff at the moment, I remind people, this trend of increased protectionism, if you will, of trying to focus on creating economic advantage for what you believe is your domestic economy, this is something that's been going on for a while now. It just has reached an entirely different level. In part because what you are seeing is a political objective in the United States that's designed to do two broad things. One, fundamentally change the global trade and tariff system. Two, create an economic environment in which manufacturing returns to the United States. Either one of those would be a huge undertaking. You're trying to do two of them simultaneously. In the United States, we have not been a major manufacturer from a global perspective. You got to go back to the 70s and the 80s. Our economy has fundamentally changed over the course of the last 40 years. If you look at the next four economies, China, Germany, Japan, and India, they remain largely manufacturing based. That's not us. Secondly, our economy is consumer driven. We're a nation of 335 million. We have among the highest per capita income in the world. What does that mean? We are not driven as much by exports, because again, we don't manufacture as much. We are not driven as much by exports. Our economy is driven by our spending. Very unique. The Chinese have been trying to shift their economy to this model for a decade now. Because the good thing that's worked out for America, when you are domestically and consumption driven, you generally are better positioned to withstand economic downturns in other parts of the world. When your economy is export-based like China, you are very much driven by the ability to have markets that will take your exports. And when those markets start to have financial problems, you start to have economic and financial problems. So it's one huge advantage for us that we really enjoy, that we sometimes take for granted. So this idea of increased protectionism. Secondly, I would argue you're watching governments take on a greater regulatory role for about the last 8 years or so. Governments increasingly arguing, you see it in the United States. I literally travel all over the world, from Australia, Japan, Singapore, China, the Middle East, Europe, the United States. What you see is this idea that, apologize, I just lost my train of thought for a minute. I'll pivot to something else. So the other thing I think that we also need to be mindful of is that we also live in a world at the moment where increasingly institutions are questioned. Do they work? Are they worthwhile? Should we continue them? Now remember, for good or bad, following the Second World War, the United States led the creation of a broader set of global institutions that were designed to theoretically provide stability and to be problem-solving mechanisms. So think about the United Nations, think about the World Trade Organization, think about the World Health Organization, think about the World Bank, think about the IMF. You can throw together all the acronyms you want. But broadly, the model since the Second World War has been that we would create these global institutions as a way to create stability and deal with broad global problems. And I would argue you're watching for the last 5, 10 years, the broader world, not just in our society, but societies around the world, questioning, are those institutions effective? Is that the approach that we really want to take? Take a look at COVID, the single greatest global health issue in a century since the Spanish influenza in 1918 and 1919. And yet, with all these global organizations, how did individual nations respond to the COVID phenomena? Individually. It was everybody did their own thing, simplistically. There wasn't this large global integrated effort, which had been a historic norm, in part because of this perception that these organizations aren't working. They aren't delivering the outcomes that people expect, that people built them to do. So we live in a world in which increasingly institutions are no longer viewed as effective, and increasingly citizens are distrustful of institutions, whether it be government. I would argue you see that here in the United States. You're watching a viewpoint that says government, at least at the federal level, is bloated and is inefficient. Now, I'll leave that up to you to decide if you think that's right or wrong. I spent 37 years as part of that structure, so I definitely have an opinion. But you see a broad view in our society right now that government has become too large, government is inefficient, ineffective, and government needs to be changed. Now, it's an interesting discussion about, so what should the nature of that change be, and what's the best way to achieve it? But broadly, our society at the moment seems to believe that, hey, we need to make some changes with respect to government. So I talked about how we've got this massive economic disruption at the moment where the United States is fundamentally trying to change two different dimensions. I would argue you're also seeing in the United States right now a sense of government's got to fundamentally change in a way we just haven't seen in most of our lifetimes. I just don't remember the last time I can think of, forget about administrations, just you look across U.S. history. It's been a long time since we have seen an environment in which government is undergoing so much change. And again, if you want to ask a question, I'd be glad to give you an opinion, but I'm not here to say good or bad. I'm just here to say, hey, look, it's happening. So we got to figure out as a society how we're going to deal with that, and what is the role of the government, and what does an effective government look like? Big, small? Leave that up to you. At the same time, we're living in a world of amazing technological change. Who here does not have a digital device physically with them, AKA a phone? Is there anybody in this room who doesn't have a phone with them? So think back. I'll show you my age. I am 65 years old. In the world that I grew up in, we didn't have this. And yet, we've created a world where one technology, in literally less than 30 years, has now become so ubiquitous that none of us go anywhere without it. I can't think of another technology in my lifetime where literally it was, I got to have this thing with me wherever I go. Again, that's not a criticism. You see it with the phone, and I would argue the next one you're seeing that's going to be like that is artificial intelligence. This idea of a technology that is so ubiquitous, so broad, so integrated into not only our business lives and the professional, national security and economic security, but this is going to dramatically impact our personal lives, and it's going to change our society. If you are in a profession right now that is into creation of content, I would argue you got a slightly different future, because AI is just going to create content like there's no tomorrow. If you're a code writer, for example, the world I grew up in as a cybersecurity kind of guy, if you're a code writer, within the next few years, I think you're going to see very little code written by humans. We're going to do this with technology. On the positive side, it's going to give us speed, it's going to give us scale, and it's going to help us to be more efficient. On the downside, it will be incredibly disruptive. It will change industries. It will impact lives. And we need to think about the second and third order ethical and moral dimensions of it. And that is worth thinking about. Because like any technology, it's not that the technology is inherently evil, it's how we decide to use it. Go back 80 years ago, at the time, the world developed what it thought was the most fundamentally changing and terrifying technology the world had ever seen. We used nuclear fission to create the greatest weapon the world had ever seen, to end the greatest war the world had ever seen. We were so concerned about that technology that it was developed by government. We kept it tightly under government control. And yet, within a decade, we said to ourselves, when you split the atom, you can generate commercial electrical power. you know, when you split the atom, you can actually propel ships with this. So I try to remind people, look, it's not necessarily that technology is good or bad. It's the way man decides to use the technology. And even the most terrifying technology when it was developed that we thought was so fundamentally, had the potential to so fundamentally cause so much damage that it had to be so tightly controlled, we over time changed our view of it. Even as we continue to have those concerns, don't get me wrong, but we also said to ourselves, it has some other implications. The other point I would try to argue that the world is trying to deal with right now, and I kind of talked about it in the beginning, is the world is trying to come to grips with an American leadership that has a different vision of how America should act in the broader world around us. You're seeing this play out particularly in Europe right now, where the message the United States is saying to the Europeans, and I'm at the Munich Security Conference and the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland every year. I was in the hall in Munich in February when the Vice President of the United States spoke, which just, I've never seen a European audience so shocked in my entire professional life. I think they felt like they'd been hit by a 2x4. But America is fundamentally saying to Europe, you have got to stand on your own 2 feet. You have got to show a commitment to your defense and your security. And potentially, you can't count on us the same way you always have. Why? Because from a US perspective right now, this administration's view is our 2 greatest security challenges from a traditional kind of geopolitical lens is the border and China. And this administration is telling Europe, all those resources, those military forces, that money that we've been spending, you guys can't ride on our coattails. And that's the message the Europeans think they're hearing right now, which is causing a high level of disruption for them because they're trying to figure, so is America a partner I can continue to count on the way I have for the last 80 years? Or am I getting a signal that America has a fundamentally different view and I need, therefore, to pivot to a different approach, perhaps more independent, perhaps more, not just the political side, but the economic side? Because remember those tariffs I mentioned really quickly? We are applying them to those we have traditionally considered to be competitors or adversaries, like the Chinese. At the same time, we're doing it to our friends in Europe, our neighbors in Canada and Mexico. And so many of the nations around the world are trying to figure out, okay, so what does this mean? What are the implications for our nation, for the choices that we make? And so with that, I'm mindful of the time. I want us to make sure that we get plenty of time for questions. That was designed to just give you a sample, if you will. But I really look forward both to the fireside chat we're going to have, but more importantly, I really look forward to what's on your guys' mind. Thanks very much.
And at this time, I'd like to invite the former mayor of Nashville, Carl Dean, to the stage. Mayor Dean is also the chairman of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Yep. So, Mayor, we're glad you're here. And as a reminder, we will have time for questions, so get those questions ready.
Who doesn't like a former mayor? Welcome,
no,
sir.
Dustin, thank you. Thank you, Admiral, and thank you for being here, and thank you to Pinnacle for putting this event on. We really appreciate that. Let me just say a word about the Tennessee World Affairs Council, which is a nonpartisan organization that the idea is that informed citizens should know about the world. They should know about the issues that confront not just the United States, but every country in the world, and become informed so that they're able to perform their responsibilities as citizens in a meaningful way. So that's what we do. If you're interested in looking at the organization or upcoming events, go to tenwalk.com and you'll find all you need to know. So thank you for being here, and thank you for those remarks. So you have worked with President Obama, President Biden, President Trump, and then President Obama and President Biden, so 3.
3 very similar individuals.
Right. So how are they? How much fun was it, and how do they differ, and how are they alike?
So first of all, I thought all 3 broadly always wanted to do what they believed was in the best interest of the nation. Now, they fundamentally had different ways about doing it. They fundamentally had different approaches. They were 3 fundamentally different individuals. President Obama, constitutional scholar by background. Remember, he starts as a lawyer, constitutional lawyer based on education, becomes a community activist in Chicago, where I'm from, and then ultimately runs for a political office, becomes a senator, and ultimately wins his first time he runs for the presidency. When you dealt with him as a lawyer by training, he was into the Socratic method. So he's the only guy I ever worked for. He would say, Mike, give me your opinion. Then he would say, okay, now I want you to argue the contrary viewpoint. I was like, what, sir? But I just told you I thought this was Mike, I want to hear a contrary viewpoint. It's like, okay, sir. On the other hand, there always was a bit of a wall. I always thought you never really only his friends really got to Barack the individual. And that's not a criticism, it's an observation. He was always very kind. He had my back multiple times. I will be forever grateful to him. He was a great leader. He really was. You can certainly disagree with some of his policies if you'd like, but he was a great leader. I loved working for him. President Biden, he had been in government literally his entire life. He started after he went to law school, he starts as a U.S. attorney. I literally live now about 5 miles from where he lives in in Delaware. I'm on the Pennsylvania side of the border, but he's right across the border 5 miles away in Delaware. He had lived almost his entire life in the government. Again, not a criticism, an observation. So what did that mean? He understood structure, he understood process, he knew the culture, and he fundamentally believed that the culture, the structure, the process were good things, good starting points. He didn't start with an attitude that said, hey, look, I distrust this. He was very trusting of the structure. He also had very well-established opinions because he'd been in foreign affairs particularly. Remember, he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He had been working geopolitics and national security for decades before he became the president. And I can remember particularly when he was the vice president, but I would argue when he was president as well, he generally always knew his view on a topic. He also was a bit irascible. I'll be very honest and direct. He was a bit irascible and had a bit of a temper. He's the only president who I've watched drop the F-bomb to me personally multiple times in meetings personally. He was occasionally a little frustrated. And so he was just a little different in that regard. President Trump, take away your opinions of him. The first time you meet him, so he's a tall guy.
Yeah, bigger than you expect.
Big guy. He is a gregarious kind of guy. You meet him, looks you in the eye, firm handshake. He would slap you on the back. He'd punch you on the shoulder. Mike, how you doing today? Yes, Mr. President. He was almost charismatic. If you just interacted with him and there wasn't any media around, he was almost charismatic. Now, he was a guy who was very different when media was around to me. He very much was always playing to the media, so you always had to remember that when you were around him and you were dealing with him. On the other hand, he was fundamentally different from the other two in the sense that, number one, again, not a criticism, an observation. He's the only president in our lifetimes of anyone in this room who became the president with no political background or experience. An observation, not a criticism. What does that mean? Not familiar with government structure, not familiar with government process, and he came in, and he would tell you this, with a bias that government was inefficient, ineffective, too large and bloated. That was his kind of background. That was his going in position. He also, on the other hand, President Obama, for example, he believed strongly in consensus. So sometimes we would spend a lot of time on issues to get to a consensus to make a recommendation to him. President Trump, I've never seen an individual who was so comfortable making decisions so quickly. I mean, he would listen to you and he'd say, okay, this is what we're going to do. Because he would say to you, I'm not a politician, I'm a business guy. And as a business guy, I'm about decision making and outcomes. I'm not about endless deliberation. You bureaucrats, he would sometimes say that. And I can remember thinking, looking over my shoulder, sir, I'm a warrior, I'm not a bureaucrat, I'm a military guy. But, so they were fundamentally different, and they each had a very different worldview. Obama and President Biden, very much of the America should be strongly involved in the broader world around it, financially, politically, militarily. President Trump, Too many other nations have been living off the significant investments we have been making as a nation in national security, and it's time that that changes. And he would also say, and all too often we have been willing to use the military as a primary element of response, and we got to stop that. You know, we've got to stay out of wars. And you watch, I would argue, if you look at, he's in the Middle East, concluding his initial foreign visits, not counting the Pope's funeral, but, and what you hear him talking about, economics, economics, economics. When he talks about China, as an example, when President Biden talked about China, you heard the following: fentanyl, climate, labor practices, practices of the Communist Party in governing the nation, Taiwan, border disputes. President Trump so far, what has he said about China? And President Biden would talk about the economy. President Trump, what has he talked about so far about China? The economy and fentanyl. He hasn't talked about those other issues. Why? One of the things that President Trump is also very different from his predecessors, his view was, we are getting distracted by too many issues that aren't the core. The core issue with China is the economy. And if we address the economic issues with China, everything else we'll be able to take care of. But by this obsession, his characterization, with this broader set of issues, it means we never get anything done, and it means we just endlessly talk. And so his model is, and I would argue you see that now, focus on the economic dimensions, fix that. It's likewise with the Russians. You look at Ukraine and what his policy towards the Russians, and I had a discussion with him in particular about this one time with President Trump. We were talking about Russia, and he said to me, Mike, you know, I'm in a different place than you are. And I said, sir, I understand my job is to provide you a perspective and input, and the answer, as the commander-in-chief, you'll make the decision that you feel is appropriate. His argument was the same thing with the Russians. Why are we in such a bad place with the nation that, number one, has among the largest critical mineral deposits in the world? That's among the largest oil and natural gas producing nations in the world. That's one of the largest grain exporters in the world. And that has the largest nuclear weapons inventory in the world. He said, instead of focusing on getting to a better place with these guys, why is it that we decided to make Ukraine our buddy? What are the Ukrainians? Again, now, I'm not saying I agree, but this is what he would say. The Ukrainians are a nation that has a high level of corruption, and that's true, to be honest. They're getting better, but they do have a high level of corruption. And they have nothing that the United States really wants. So instead of focusing on these other guys, we picked, simplistically, trying to distill this for you, we picked the wrong horse. Let's end this war, let's get out of it. It should have never started, in his mind, it should have never started in the first place. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I am in a very different place on Russia and Ukraine, as he said to me, and he would know that. He always said, I'm in a different place than you are. When you look at the world, geopolitics, World War II is portrayed historically, and I think probably accurately, as a battle between democracy and tyranny and authoritarianism. Post-World War II, you have the Cold War, and containment becomes the policy. You get up to Nixon, you have sort of more realpolitik, negotiations. Reagan comes back with containment, and we're gonna win the Cold War. What is the theme now? How do we look at the world, and who do you see as our rival, or what is our biggest threat? So the biggest strategic challenge for us is clearly China. Look, for the first time in our lives, let's look at the Soviets for a minute. So the Cold War was a 45-year ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, in which the communist side, the Soviets, had great military power and strong political power, but were weak economically. And what happened to the Soviets in the end? The economy imploded, and they fragmented politically as a result. China is totally different. It's the first time, I would argue, we face a competitor. I view them as a competitor. Some would argue that they're an adversary. I prefer to consider them a competitor. But however you want to frame it, China combines the same unique qualities or capabilities in many ways the United States does. It is a global economic power. The Soviets never were. It has one of the largest, most capable militaries in the world. It has a broad political set of relationships with many, particularly the global south and some of the smaller nations in the world. So many of the things that we were able to do with the Soviets, they're just not going to work with the Chinese. And you're seeing that combined with the fact that over the course of the last 40 years, we have created this hyper-connected economic model. That's the reason why we don't do manufacturing in the United States the way we used to do, was we created this hyper-connected economic model where we said to ourselves, where's the cheapest place to manufacture? It's not in the United States. It's in many other parts of the world. Hey, let's move manufacturing to those other parts of the world because it will drive costs down. The challenge now to me is we created this economic model that's hyper-connected. And yet now we're in a political dynamic where there is a bit of an incentive in the minds of many political individuals about, well, perhaps we need to break that model up. Now, I would argue what you saw in the tariffs in the last week with China show you that it's just not realistic for this idea that we're totally going to decouple. I just don't think economically it's realistic. We've created an economic model that is so integrated. The idea that we're going to impose 145% tariffs on our number 3 trading partner, and it's not going to have any impact on the United States, I just don't think is realistic. You can argue it's good or bad. My view is it's just not realistic. If you define realism as will it achieve the intended goal, right. I just don't think so.
There's
and clearly he didn't, in the sense that he, said, hey, look, for at least 90 days, we're going to change it.
Natural resources such as oil have been a big part of geopolitics for decades. More recently, you hear references to precious minerals, valuable resources such as that, which has not really been present in much public discussion. How important is that, and this whole discussion about Greenland? How important? Who knew? Yeah, I mean, it was really not on the agenda, but how important is Greenland to geopolitics for the United States?
So first of all, look, what is shaping economic activity and economic growth? It's largely industries and services that are driven by technology. The underpinnings broadly of technology, at least where we are right now, you saw both President Trump in his first term, President Biden as well, they both picked technology as the way to change China's behavior. In the case of President Trump, the first time around, he decided to focus on 5G technology and isolate Huawei as one of the largest corporations in China at the time from access to the US market, and tried to also impact Huawei's ability to be competitive as a global entity, largely through the prism of a particular technology, in this case 5G, telecommunications backbone. President Biden comes in and says, well, I think technology is the way to pressure them, but I think the technology that really is going to matter is the semiconductor. Because his argument was semiconductors are the basis for most technologies in the world today. And therefore, if we can control Chinese access to critical semiconductor technology, we will both retain advantage and we will also have a significant impact on their economy. And based on that impact, we can potentially change their behavior. That was the theory of the case in his mind. President Trump comes in. So far, he's kept most, like those semiconductor restrictions are still in place. And so what you're seeing, though, in his mind, he argues energy is an area where the United States has advantage. The largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world is the United States of America. The largest exporter of oil and natural gas in the world is the United States of America. Wasn't that way 10 years ago, but it is now. And his view is that gives the U.S. strategic advantage. That gives us the ability to both help allies like the Europeans. Hey, don't buy your natural gas, because natural gas is the largest energy source and heating source in Europe. And President Trump's position has been, look, don't buy natural gas from the Russians. We'll sell it to you. We have liquid natural gas carriers. We can get it across the ocean, no problem. So his argument is energy is a huge strategic advantage. At the same time, I think he also believes that technology is going to be a huge edge. So you've seen him talking about AI regulation. In fact, he has announced that he is going to pull back the regulations put in place during the Biden administration because his view is they are too cumbersome. And instead, he's going to put forward a slightly different regime that's less odious from a regulatory standpoint, potentially offers, in his mind, the private sector greater flexibility for application and investment in AI. He's retained the semiconductor piece so far. I don't think that's going to change significantly. So we've gone through 3 terms in a row now where technology has been a shaper, if you will, of some of the economic and geopolitical and national security choices we've made. And I don't think that's going to change. Critical minerals are important because when you look at those semiconductors, some of the metal, for example, are very rare. And the advantage the Chinese have is at the moment, they have both among the greatest concentrations of the minerals within their sovereign border, but most importantly, they have become the largest for smelting and actual processing. China is the greatest processor of critical minerals to convert the mineral into the actual end product that you use for manufacturing. It's not that we can't do it. It's, again, it's a little bit of this hyper-connected world. The price point they do it at, right now, we can't match their model. And as a result, we didn't build a lot of that infrastructure. Instead, we said to ourselves, we'll buy it cheaper from the Chinese. Well, now it's becoming a bit of a weapon. And so one of the things I think you saw it with the semiconductors, you're going to see the government in the U.S. start to question, should we make strategic investments in areas that we feel we need to be producing here by buying from others? Not because they're cheaper, but because they're so strategically important, we should potentially maybe be willing to pay a slightly higher cost.
Well, these critical minerals also comes up in Ukraine in terms of the discussions that the Trump administration has had with them. What do you think? What is Putin's goal? I mean, is he some sort of genius out there? What does he want in the end, do you believe?
So I never thought Putin was a guy who spent a lot of time, spent decades of my life studying the Russians and the Soviets and the Chinese. I never thought he was a hard guy to figure out. Number one, I thought he's a guy who is trapped a bit in history in the sense of, remember when he becomes a young adult, he joins the KGB. He's actually assigned to the KGB in Dresden in Germany at the height of the Cold War. When the wall comes down, he's actually living in Germany. He's a major in the KGB. His vision, I always thought, was an extension of the world that he grew up in. Russia should be perceived as a major global player that can't be taken for granted and must be at least considered or consulted when other nations are making strategic choices. Secondly, that Russia should have what the Russians call the near abroad. Their security regime, literally, since the Second World War, has been no potential opponents on our immediate borders. We create a buffer. During the Cold War, it was the Warsaw Pact and the fact that the Soviets had significant military occupation in most of the nations of Eastern Europe, so they created a buffer where no enemy was immediately on their border. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the 3 Baltic states, Poland, enter NATO. Suddenly now, NATO has a border right with Russia. I always thought that was something that was very problematic in Putin's mind. So if you look at what triggered Ukraine specifically, and remember, he's invaded Ukraine twice. The first time he seizes Crimea in February of 2014. The second time, he attempts to dismember the entire nation in February of 2022, and that's the conflict we're in the midst of right now. He failed miserably in that goal or objective, but he was very upfront. He wrote an interesting manifesto in July of 21, 6 months or so before he invaded. He talked about how, in his mind, Ukraine has no legitimacy, that it is a facade, a construction that's purely political, that has no history behind it. He talked about the Rayus in history. Again, the Russian Orthodox Church is important in Russian society. It was created in Kyiv initially. His view was there really was no Ukraine. It was an extension of Russia. It always has been, again, in his mind. But his objectives are very specific. He said, Ukraine cannot join NATO. Ukraine cannot join the EU or align itself with the rest of Europe economically. It should instead align itself with Russia. Ukraine cannot allow, again, this was his pre-war stated objectives, Ukraine cannot allow Western military forces within its territory, nor can it create relationships that the Russians don't approve, i.e. the Russians should be consulted. I think those still effectively remain his objectives. The reason he went in and decided he was going to try to dismember Ukraine was I thought his objective was, if I can decapitate the political leadership and put instead someone in place as the political leader who's much more amenable to my viewpoint, who will be willing to make these agreements with us formally, that I always thought was the objective. Now, that part of the strategy failed. So now he's in this view of, as long as I'm fighting the Ukrainians, as long as I'm occupying Ukraine, the West will not want it to be a part of NATO. And so far, that's true. Both the United States, Germany, for example, have said, now is not a good time for Ukraine to join NATO. At some point in the future, but not now. The EU has also said, hey, right now, not a good time for Ukraine. So if you're Putin, you're going, I'm achieving my objectives. Now, it's coming at a high cost, economically, losses on the battlefield. But that's the final comment I would make is that's also reflective of Russia as a society. If you've spent any time dealing with the Russians or been in Russia, it is the most fatalistic society that I have ever seen. Its broad history has always been, and excuse my language, life sucks, life always sucks, life always will suck, it has always been hard. That is the nature of life. They are willing as a society in many ways to endure a threshold of pain that for us, we would like, no way. We're getting rid of this government. What the hell is going on? That is not the Russian model. It's been an authoritarian system. It's had a really short compression with democracy. It didn't work well for them. They've had an authoritarian structure for centuries. That's just the norm for them, and Putin is an extension of that past.
Great. Well, let's open it up to the audience.
Question time.
We have microphones here and a microphone there, and so if you could line up and keep your questions relatively short, but
Fire away.
yep,
Take it away.
Thanks for your service.
Tell us your name, sir.
Jarrett Bell. I'm going to try to be quick. I could ask you questions all day, so maybe you'll start a podcast.
There you go.
You mentioned China as obviously a critical issue, and artificial intelligence obviously is growing. Access to power. I think there's some charts that show access to power is critical to the wealth of nations. So with that in mind, and I understand that China is bringing online 96 gigawatts of power this year, which is roughly the equivalent of 50 Denvers. That's a lot of power. Where
Mostly
do we
coal-fired plants, too. China builds more coal-fired power plants than the rest of the world together.
So with that in mind, and knowing that artificial intelligence requires huge amounts of power, I think I've even heard the terawatt thrown out from Elon Musk. What are your thoughts on how we can be competitive from a power generation standpoint, and is it actually possible to physically deliver what we see as the power requirements that we need over the next 10, 20 years without massive blackouts?
Right, so the first comment I would make, over time, if you look at energy efficiency associated with, data centers, for example, I think technology is moving us in a much better direction. The efficiency levels are going up. Now, we're still going to have significant power increases, but I think it's going to be a little less than right now we're thinking. I think we're doing some amazing things in battery efficiency and power effectiveness. It also is going to highlight that we're going to need to create greater power generation capacity. So I think you're going to see nuclear come back in the United States. Not going to be the scale it was in the 60s and the 70s, but I think you'll see nuclear power come back because there's also some interesting technology. Small modular reactors are amazing compared to what we're used to. I think in addition, you're going to see the government trying to make the regulatory piece. It is so hard. If you want to build a power plant, if you want to build a refinery, if you want to build a petrochemical plant right now in our nation, we need those things, but it is really difficult. You look at the environment.